12 years ago today, a Boeing 777 carrying 239 people lifted off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport and flew into the night. It never arrived at its destination. It never landed anywhere else. It was never seen again. Today is March the 8th, 2026. In those 12 years, 3 countries have spent more than $150 million searching over 120,000 square kilometers of ocean floor. A private company has twice deployed underwater robots into the southern Indian Ocean, most recently completing a 28-day scan in January of this year, covering more than 7,500 square kilometers of seabed. They found nothing. No fuselage, no engines, no black boxes. 20 pieces of debris have washed ashore on the coastlines of Eastern Africa and islands across the Indian Ocean. A flaperon here, a fragment of interior panel there. But the aircraft itself and the 239 people inside it remain missing. This is the story of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. Not a story of answers, because 12 years later there are almost none, but a story of what the data tells us, what the systems recorded, what the silence means, and why, in an age when a smartphone can be tracked to within 3 feet, a 200-ton airliner can still vanish from the face of the earth. It begins on the evening of March the 7th, 2014, at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. The captain arrived at the Malaysia Airlines crew room just before 11 o'clock at night and signed in for duty. He was 53 years old, 33 years with the airline, more than 18,400 flight hours, 8,600 of those on the Boeing 777. He had started his career on the Fokker F-27 back in 1983 and worked his way through the 737, the A300, the 747, and the A330 before receiving his command on the 777 in 1998. By 2014, he was not only a captain, but a type rating instructor and examiner, one of the most senior pilots in the fleet. Outside of flying, he was known as a quiet, community-minded man, married, 3 children. He helped deliver groceries to elderly neighbors. He ran a small YouTube channel where he showed people how to repair household appliances. His finances were stable. His medical records were clean. Nothing in his background raised any flags. His first officer arrived about 25 minutes later. 27 years old, single, just over 2,800 hours total, and only 39 on the 777. He had joined Malaysia Airlines as a cadet in 2008, flown the 737-400, transitioned to the A330, and then moved to the 777 in November 2013, barely 4 months before this flight. He was still in training. Tonight was a line training flight, and if it went well, the captain would recommend him for his final check. This was the first time the 2 pilots had been paired together, which likely explained why the captain had shown up a bit early, probably to review the first officer's training file before the briefing. The power gradient in this cockpit was steep. A 53-year-old examiner with nearly 19,000 hours, and a 27-year-old trainee with 39 hours on type. But nothing in the record suggested any tension between them. Both had adequate rest. Both had current licenses and medicals. The pre-flight briefing was straightforward. The weather along the route looked good. A subtropical high over Thailand kept conditions calm around Kuala Lumpur, and Beijing was clear. The only potential issue was a jet stream about 2/3 of the way up the route that could cause some turbulence. 2 alternates were filed for Beijing. The crew agreed on a final fuel load of 49,100 kilograms, enough for approximately 7 hours and 31 minutes of flight. The planned flight time to Beijing was 5 hours and 34 minutes. That gave them roughly 2 hours of reserve. A normal, unremarkable fuel decision. After the briefing, the 2 pilots met their cabin crew, 10 flight attendants, the most junior of whom had 13 years of experience, and the most senior over 35. They walked together out to the aircraft. It was a Boeing 777-200ER, registration 9 Mike Romeo Oscar, powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Trent 892 engines. The tech log showed it was in perfect working condition. The only maintenance note was that the flight crew oxygen cylinder had been topped up just before departure, a routine service item. Outside the terminal, the Malaysian night was warm and humid. A light haze hung over the airport. At the gates, the last passengers were boarding. Families with young children, students returning to university in Beijing, a group of calligraphers heading to an exhibition, engineers and business people traveling for Monday morning meetings. Among them were a couple in their 70s who had saved for years to visit their grandchildren in China, and a young painter whose canvases were stored in the cargo hold below. None of them had any reason to think this flight was different from the thousands that departed Kuala Lumpur every week. The cabin doors closed, the jet bridge pulled back. The ground crew gave their final signals, and in the cockpit, the two pilots completed their before-start checklist and called for pushback. From the outside, the 777 looked exactly like what it was, a routine red-eye departure on a well-traveled route between two of Asia's largest cities. In the cabin, 227 passengers from 14 nations settled into their seats. 153 were Chinese citizens, the largest group on board. 50 were Malaysian, 7 Indonesian. The rest came from a dozen other countries. 2 passengers were later found to have been traveling on stolen passports, both identified as Iranian nationals believed to be seeking refugee status, not considered a threat. None of the other passengers raised any suspicion. The first officer, as pilot flying, began the pre-flight preparation in the cockpit. At 23:56 and 8 seconds, he entered the flight number and airline information into the flight management computer. We know the exact time because of a system called ACARS, the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System. ACARS is a digital data link that connects the aircraft to ground stations through either VHF radio or satellite communications. It transmits routine operational data automatically and allows the airline to send messages, weather updates, and flight plans directly to the cockpit. The satellite component of ACARS, the SATCOM, had booted up and established a connection through an Inmarsat satellite at 23:54. It captured the first officer's inputs moments later. Everything was working normally. To understand what this system means and what its silence will later tell us, you need to know one thing. The SATCOM is designed to maintain a continuous link between the aircraft and the ground, even over the most remote stretches of ocean. If the aircraft doesn't send any data for a full hour, the satellite automatically pings it, a digital handshake, just to confirm the connection is still alive, and the aircraft responds. This happens automatically, without any crew input. It is, in essence, a system built to make sure that a commercial airliner can never truly disappear. That detail will become the most important fact in this entire story. At 12:40 in the morning on March the 8th, Kuala Lumpur Tower cleared Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 for takeoff from runway 32 right. The first officer was at the controls. The captain handled the radio. The engines stabilized, the thrust levers went forward, and the 777 accelerated down the runway. At 12:42, the SATCOM recorded the aircraft as airborne. Everything was transmitting normally. Identification codes, position data, altitude, speed. A routine departure into a clear tropical night. After takeoff, the captain switched to departure frequency as standard procedure required. The controller canceled the filed departure route and cleared them direct to a waypoint called IGARI, the handover point between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace, with a climb to flight level 180. The captain read it back. The first officer verified the waypoint in the flight management computer and selected the altitude, completely routine. The voice on the radio sounded relaxed. The aircraft climbed northeast toward IGARI. They were handed off to Kuala Lumpur Area Control on frequency 132.6. The captain checked in, received clearance to climb to flight level 250, and 3 minutes later was cleared further to their requested cruise altitude of flight level 350. At 1 minute and 14 seconds past 1 in the morning, the captain called in to confirm they were level at 350. His voice was calm, the kind of slightly dropping intonation that comes with a routine call at the end of a long climb. 7 minutes later, he made the same call again, level at 350. The official report noted this as anomalous, but did not consider it significant. There are 2 reasons a pilot makes that call twice. Either he forgot he already made it, unlikely since it was not a mandatory report, or he had been away from the frequency for a few minutes and wanted to confirm that ATC hadn't tried to reach him while he was occupied with something else. The tone of the second call was subtly different, busier, more clipped, the sound of someone working on something while talking. It may mean nothing, But it is the last moment where anything in the captain's voice can be analyzed, because what comes next is silence. At 1:19 and 24 seconds, the Kuala Lumpur controller instructed Flight 370 to contact Ho Chi Minh Control on frequency 120.9. The captain responded. His transmission was brief. He did not read back the frequency, a minor omission, but standard practice requires it. The aircraft was now about 1 minute from crossing IGARI into Vietnamese airspace. 5 seconds after passing IGARI, the Mode S transponder, the component that transmits detailed identification, altitude, and speed data to secondary radar, was switched off. Not all at once. First, the enhanced data stream stopped. Then, 37 seconds later, the secondary radar return disappeared entirely. A technical failure would have killed both signals simultaneously. This sequential shutdown is consistent with someone in the cockpit turning the transponder knob from the normal position to the off position. It was a deliberate act. To understand what this means, you need to know what a transponder does and what happens when it stops. Under normal circumstances, commercial aircraft are tracked by 2 types of radar simultaneously. Secondary radar relies on the transponder, a small radio transmitter inside the aircraft that responds to interrogation signals from ground stations. It broadcasts a 4-digit identification code, the aircraft's altitude, speed, and position. It is what makes the aircraft visible on air traffic control screens, with a neat label showing its call sign and flight level. It is also what makes apps like Flight Radar 24 work, and what powers the collision avoidance system that prevents aircraft from hitting each other in mid-air. When the transponder is switched off, all of that vanishes. The aircraft becomes invisible to secondary radar, invisible to other aircraft's collision avoidance systems, and invisible to any tracking website. The only thing that can still detect it is primary radar, the older technology that sends out radio pulses and listens for reflections bouncing off physical objects. Primary radar does not need the aircraft's cooperation, but it has significant limitations. It cannot determine altitude reliably, it cannot identify what it is seeing, and its range is far shorter than secondary radar. Beyond a few hundred nautical miles from a ground station, a primary radar return is little more than a faint, anonymous dot, if it shows up at all. At almost exactly the same moment, the aircraft stopped following its planned route to Beijing. Primary radar, the old technology that sends out radio pulses and listens for echoes bouncing off physical objects, recorded what happened next. The 777 began a sharp left turn, nearly 180 degrees, back toward the Malay Peninsula. Boeing later tried to replicate this turn in a simulator. They could not match the radar data using autopilot. The turn was too tight. It required a steeper bank angle than the autopilot would allow. Someone was hand-flying the aircraft. The timing and location of this maneuver were not random. Agari sat at the exact boundary between 2 countries' airspace. The Malaysian controller had just handed the aircraft off and was no longer watching closely. The Vietnamese controller was waiting for the aircraft to call in, and it never did. In the gap between 2 jurisdictions, in the middle of the night, the aircraft turned around and no one noticed. The turn also carefully avoided Thailand's air defense identification zone to the north, a monitored corridor where military radar would have tracked and investigated any unidentified aircraft. Whoever was flying knew the airspace, knew the boundaries, knew where the gaps were. The aircraft threaded between the Thai ADIZ and a nearby airway, avoiding both military scrutiny and potential traffic conflicts. After completing the turn, the aircraft continued southwest toward a VOR beacon near Penang. Primary radar tracked it, but without a transponder, there was no altitude or speed data, just a faint echo moving across the screen. The track showed small heading deviations consistent with manual flight. As the aircraft passed near Penang, a cellular tower on the island briefly detected a signal from the first officer's mobile phone. It was a fleeting connection. No call was made, no message sent. It may suggest the aircraft was at a lower altitude than normal, since cell signals have limited vertical range. Or it may mean nothing at all. If you're watching this today, 12 years to the day since this aircraft disappeared, take a moment to subscribe. This story needs to be told until the search is finished. Meanwhile, on the ground, confusion was spreading, slowly. It took the Ho Chi Minh controller 20 minutes to call Kuala Lumpur and ask where Flight 370 was. This was far longer than the standard 5-minute threshold. The Malaysian controller contacted Malaysia Airlines, who said they could see the aircraft on their tracking system flying through Cambodian airspace toward Beijing. That was wrong. The airline software was generating a predicted position based on the filed flight plan, not actual data. Controllers along the route to Beijing began calling each other, trying to establish contact with an aircraft that was now flying in the opposite direction. No one looked at the primary radar returns, showing a lone echo heading southwest through the Strait of Malacca. The military did see the turn. Malaysian military radar recorded the aircraft reversing course after IGARI. But since it wasn't violating any new airspace and appeared to be conducting a normal air turnback, not uncommon for aircraft returning to their departure airport, no one raised an alarm. No fighters were scrambled. No interception was attempted. In the control towers and radar rooms scattered across Southeast Asia, the next 2 hours became a slow-motion cascade of missed connections and wrong assumptions. When Ho Chi Minh finally called Kuala Lumpur, the Malaysian controller tried the aircraft on every available frequency. No response. He called Malaysia Airlines Operations, who checked their internal tracking system and reported that the aircraft appeared to be flying normally through Cambodian airspace on its way to Beijing. That information was wrong. The software was extrapolating a predicted position from the filed flight plan because it had not received any actual data since the transponder was switched off. But no one questioned it. Controllers in Phnom Penh, Ho Chi Minh, Hong Kong, and Beijing were each contacted in turn. Each one checked their screens, found nothing, and passed the question to the next. For more than 4 hours, the aviation system treated the disappearance of a wide-body airliner carrying 239 people as a communication problem rather than an emergency. The Search and Rescue Coordination Center in Kuala Lumpur was not activated until 5:30 in the morning, 4 hours after the last radio transmission. It was only later, through radar playbacks, that the full picture of the aircraft's path emerged. As the aircraft continued northwest through the Malacca Strait, the SATCOM system remained silent. At 2:03 in the morning, a ground station attempted to send an ACARS message to the aircraft. No acknowledgement came back, but this was not a simple case of ACARS being switched off. If ACARS alone had failed, the SATCOM link would still have responded. It would have simply reported that ACARS was unavailable. And if someone had manually logged the system off from the cockpit, that action would have been recorded in the satellite log. Neither happened. The most probable explanation, according to investigators and experienced 777 pilots who have studied the data extensively, is that the aircraft's primary electrical power sources were manually disconnected. On a 777, this can be done by deselecting both the main generators from their buses using switches on the overhead panel. Doing so would trigger the aircraft to attempt an automatic start of the auxiliary power unit. To prevent that, the person in control would need to move the APU switch to the on position and then back to off. The ram air turbine, a small emergency propeller that drops into the airstream, would then deploy, providing enough power for basic flight instruments and navigation, but not for the SATCOM, ACARs, or most cabin systems. It would also plunge the cabin into darkness. This is where the facts end and informed analysis begins. We do not know what happened to the passengers and crew. We do not know who was in control of the aircraft. The official investigation report, released in July 2018, concluded that the cause of the disappearance could not be determined without the flight recorders and main wreckage. It did not assign blame. It did not name a perpetrator. It noted that unlawful interference by a third party could not be ruled out. It found no evidence of remote control, and it identified significant failures by air traffic control in both Malaysia and Vietnam to follow standard procedures for alerting authorities when contact was lost. What we do know comes from the satellite. At 2:25 and 27 seconds in the morning, almost exactly 1 hour after the aircraft completed its turn, the SATCOM system suddenly came back to life. It sent a log-on request to the Inmarsat satellite. This was the first of 7 satellite handshakes that would be recorded over the next 6 hours. The data from this first handshake showed a large frequency error in the signal, consistent with the satellite transmitter's internal crystal oscillator not yet having reached its operating temperature after a prolonged power interruption. This confirms that the SATCOM had been without power for an extended period and had only just been restored. The handshake also lacked a valid flight ID and company identifier, data that the aircraft had transmitted correctly before. This is consistent with someone having manually disabled the satellite communications through the cockpit's communication manager page before the system fully rebooted, erasing the identifying information while allowing the basic satellite link to function. The SATCOM was never designed to track aircraft, but because it exchanged signals with the Inmarsat satellite at known times, analysts could reverse engineer a crude position estimate for each handshake. The time delay between the satellite's ping and the aircraft's response, called burst timing offset, placed the aircraft somewhere along an arc at a specific distance from the satellite. 7 handshakes produced 7 arcs. Combined with burst frequency offset analysis, which used Doppler shift to determine whether the aircraft was moving toward or away from the satellite, and whether it was climbing or descending, investigators could narrow the possible flight paths. The data pointed south after the last primary radar contact near a waypoint called MECAR at 2:22 in the morning, when the aircraft was at the extreme edge of military radar range. The satellite handshakes traced a path that curved down through the Indian Ocean. Most analysts agree that the aircraft likely turned from its northwesterly heading somewhere near a waypoint called Nilam onto a more southwesterly course, passing west of Indonesia and eventually heading deep into the southern Indian Ocean. The aircraft flew for approximately 7 hours and 35 minutes after takeoff, closely matching the calculated fuel endurance of 7 hours and 31 minutes based on the recorded fuel load. The 7th and final handshake occurred at 8:19 Malaysian time. It was a log-on request, the same type as the first, most likely triggered by a power interruption caused by fuel exhaustion in one or both engines. The burst frequency offset data from this final transmission suggested the aircraft may have been in a steep descent, possibly as high as 14,500 feet per minute. After this, there was nothing. No more signals, no emergency locator transmitter activation, no debris sighted by any vessel or satellite in the days that followed. 239 people and a 200-ton aircraft had simply ceased to exist on any human monitoring system. The search that followed became the largest and most expensive in aviation history. Surface vessels and aircraft from 10 nations scoured the seas. Satellite imagery was analyzed. Acoustic searches for the flight recorder beacons found nothing. Between 2014 and 2017, more than 120,000 square kilometers of ocean floor were mapped and scanned. In 2018, Ocean Infinity deployed autonomous underwater vehicles across an additional 112,000 square kilometers. Nothing. Then the debris began to arrive. On July 29, 2015, more than 16 months after the disappearance, a flaperon from a Boeing 777 washed ashore on Reunion Island, more than 5,000 kilometers from the search zone. It was confirmed as belonging to 9 Mike Romeo Oscar. Over the following months and years, more than 20 pieces of debris were found along the coastlines of Mozambique, Tanzania, Madagascar, Mauritius, and South Africa. Interior panels, fragments of the engine cowling, pieces that could only have come from MH370. Drift analysis traced their origins back to the southern Indian Ocean, broadly consistent with the area defined by the 7th arc. But the main wreckage, the flight recorders, the answers, remained on the ocean floor somewhere in the vast darkness below. The investigation report released in 2018 ran to 495 pages. It confirmed the ATC failures. It confirmed that the aircraft's tracking systems were deliberately disabled. It confirmed the Inmarsat analysis. And it concluded with a single devastating sentence. The team was unable to determine the real cause of the disappearance. The head of the investigation told reporters that it was not truly a final report. The wreckage had not been found. No victims had been found. Without the black boxes, there could be no real conclusion. In the years since, improvements have been made. ICAO now requires commercial aircraft to transmit their position at least every 15 minutes when flying over oceans. New generation aircraft are being designed with satellite tracking systems that cannot be disabled from the cockpit. Flight recorder battery life has been extended from 30 days to 90. These changes exist because of MH370. because before March 8, 2014, no one believed a modern airliner could disappear. But the families are still waiting. 239 families in 14 countries. 12 years without a funeral for most of them. 12 years without a confirmed cause. 12 years of theories and searches and press conferences that end with the same words. No findings that confirm the location of the aircraft wreckage. The most recent search concluded on January 23rd of this year. Ocean Infinity's vessel, Armada 8605, spent 28 operational days scanning a new 15,000 square kilometer zone in the southern Indian Ocean. Adverse weather cut the operation short. Approximately 7,500 square kilometers were surveyed. The Malaysian Transport Ministry released its update this morning, 12 years to the day. The search activities have not yielded any findings that confirm the location of the aircraft wreckage. The government remains committed to keeping families informed. The SATCOM system aboard 9 Mike Romeo Oscar, the system designed to make sure a commercial airliner could never truly disappear, sent its last signal at 8:19 on the morning of March 8, 2014. It was a log-on request, a machine trying to reconnect, a digital handshake reaching out into the silence, answered by a satellite that recorded the time, the frequency, and the distance, and nothing else. 7 handshakes, 7 arcs drawn across the Indian Ocean. Somewhere along the last one, at a depth that may exceed 4,000 meters, lies a Boeing 777, and the answers that 239 families have been waiting 12 years to hear. The search is not over. It cannot be over. Because every piece of debris that washes onto a beach in Africa is a reminder that the ocean knows where this aircraft is. We just haven't looked in the right place yet. If this story moved you, there is one right here that you need to see next. Another aircraft, another ocean, another set of signals that everyone thought were lost, until someone found a way to read them.